levees that were abandoned long ago, and land that is uninhabitable because every year when the river rises, it's a natural spillway, it floods. When Charles approached me about writing this book, I was a little concerned about how to write an interesting story about a spillway. I thought it would only have a small niche audience, and I didn't want to write a dissertation outlining the facts of what had occurred. We talked about ways in which we could make a spillway story interesting, and we agreed that creating characters that these events happened to was the best way to tell this story. That's why we chose to write this book as historical fiction, based on the true story of the Bohemia Spillway. It's an important story, and we wanted to reach the widest audience possible. As we began our research, Charles suggested people I could interview who grew up on the East Bank and who were familiar with, whose families had come from the East Bank, who now lived on the West Bank of the river, and they were familiar with the way of life. I had no idea when we started this project how interesting my subject matter would be. Sometimes we scheduled interviews, but sometimes I knocked on doors in Point-a-la-Hache. I knocked on one door, Mrs. Hester Henry, an African-American woman in her 80s who had lived in the area for much of her life, invited me in. We talked for a while, and when I left, I knew I had the name of one of the main characters, Hester. Inspiration for this book came from everywhere, from the river, from the culture of the areas in the 1920s, from the food. I can't even tell you how many times when we were editing this book, Charles would call me and say, they didn't eat that, they ate marsh hens. You know, he knew so much about that area, and it was so helpful. The people whose ancestors lived in towns and villages down there, like Union Settlement, Nichols, Dime, Nestor, and we also got information from historical events that happened during that time outside of the Bohemia Spillway. The research was extensive, and Wilma Heaton, a former member of the Orleans Levee District who's here today, was invaluable to us. It wasn't an easy task to write this book. It was my first attempt at historical fiction, and weaving truth and fiction together was difficult. But what we did was we took all the people we interviewed and we just combined their stories into these characters so that we could accurately depict that era. I learned so much along the way and hope that through characters like Anna Marie and Claude Cuvion, Hester and Abraham Jackson, and Sinan Estilian de Voulamé, he was a remedy man that predicted the blood moon that would come over Bohemia when the end was near. Through all of these characters, we depicted what it was like for those who lost their land, homes, and oil revenue to greedy politicians. I heard over and over that the people in Plaquemines Parish feel like they are expendable, always losing to the interest of New Orleans. This book shows that these people were not expendable. They were important. Their way of life, their culture, their values, and their beliefs were important. And most of all, they did not deserve what happened to them. This parish did not deserve to lose such valuable land and a whole population of people. The descendants of those who once lived in the area that came to be known as Bohemia fought back in the 80s and won. Some of the land, along with mineral rights, was returned, but it's uninhabitable and useless now. To date, the Levee District has settled for $15 million to be split between hundreds of people, but litigation is ongoing. Charles and I worked hard to create an accurate depiction of what happened on that east bank of the river. We hope you enjoy it, and we hope it helps people understand the richness of the culture and the history of the area. And I'd like to introduce to y'all Charles Ballay, District Attorney of Plaquemines Parish, who grew up in a town called Home Place on the west bank of the river.
Thank you, Susan. Great. She really covers it all quite well, right? First, I want to thank you all for inviting us, and of course, thank you folks for being here today. It's something that's been, I guess, in my mind to do a long time, but I'm more visual, so I always thought of doing a movie, writing a movie script, and I'd write an index card, I'd put it aside, and 4 or 5 months later, I'd think of something again, I'd write another one and just put it down. And I had it all planned out. Morgan Freeman was going to be my star, and we were going to make this big old production. And, but everybody kept telling me, you have to write a book. You're protected that way, one, if someone steals your idea. And also, that's got to get out there first before you have any people really thinking about your story, about making a movie. and which we're working on. We're going to get there. But so yeah, I grew up in Home Place, just south of Port Sulphur, and before you had sulfur discovered in the 30s, you didn't have a Port Sulphur. That came in, it came in when they had sulfur. They put a port there in the river and all. And so you had these different names that are on our map in our book, and most of you might know some of them. Of course, that they had Potash and in Home Place and Narren and Empire and Buras and on down the road. And on the East Bank was the same, in that you had a lot of different settlements, different town names. Point Lahash was the parish seat. And of course, below that, you had Bohemia, which was a plantation. A lot of places were named after the plantations that were there, many years ago. And really, it's funny how it was called the Bohemia Spillway, but this spillway was just south of the Bohemia plantation line, so it really wasn't in Bohemia. It was below it, but it took that name on since it was a very prominent plantation that they had back then in Bohemia. But there was a lot of settlements, and as Susan just explained, it was really made up of a lot of diverse people. There was Polish and French, of course, Spanish, black, white, a whole bunch of different folks in that area. Rice was a very big crop that was raised years ago down in that area. Of course, it disappeared later, but it was a big thing. And in that area, had some big rice farmers, big rice places. Haspel and Davis had a big operation. You had a number of folks that had rice places. And in fact, my dad grew up. He was from Home Place, born and raised there. He was born in 1911. And when he was a kid, they had rice on the West Bank where they were. And it disappeared later on. Citrus was around for many years, but a lot of people did live off the land, and they were very fortunate they could easily. Of course, we have an abundant amount of seafood. We've always had shrimp, oysters, fish, all those things. And you could get wild game, ducks and, like I said, marsh hens and different things. And so people, while we had a depression in America, it really didn't affect some of your rural areas in some places like Plaquemines as much because they had a lot of food. It was always there. It kind of worked. And but what the tragedy of this situation is that people this was their home, this is where they liked, this is where they lived, and they were forced off the property. They really were. And as she said, it was a spillway 50 miles downriver from the city. So, anybody with knowing how water goes downhill, how it doesn't make much sense out at the end. Now, can it help a little? Yeah, there's studies that were done. Did the spillway help with the 27 flood and with later floods, different things? A little, because if you're closer to the sea, of course, you're not going to flood as much if you have a big open area, you might say, at the end. It's almost like your bathtub is going to drain better if you have a bigger hole going out. Of course it does. And but at the same time, they knew it wasn't the right thing, and it didn't take them long to realize they needed one above the city. And so Bonnie Carey Spillway, of course, was put in. And it actually started in the late 20s with the planning and the finding of property and everything they were going to do. And of course, I think it opened in 33, if I'm not mistaken, around that time period, Bonnie Carey Spillway. And sooner or later, they basically abandoned the Bohemia Spillway. And I would just jump ahead that say, when they abandoned it later on, Wildlife and Fisheries took it over for a while, made it a wildlife management area where people could hunt and fish in that area. And eventually that was even given up. And so the people were after getting it back for many, many years. It never happened until finally some of our legislators, Frank Patty, Sammy Nunez, there's two of them I know that pushed for it big. And in around 1984, they got legislation that said that the property was no longer needed, serving a purpose of that Bohemia Spillway, and so it was allowed to go back. But it didn't go back easily. There was a lot of court fights after that to the state Supreme Court all around, some cases a little bit both ways. But eventually they won out and the property went back. And the people were able to make claims to get it back. So a lot of it did go back. But some people don't realize that some of this property, of course, was owned by the state. And that property, honestly, I've mentioned to Liz Murrow and to Jeff Landry and everybody, like, hey, y'all have property down there you ought to be getting back. There's oil revenue, there's coastal issues when you try to put in diversions or whatever you might be interested in doing. There's property that the state owns, I forgot how many thousands of acres, that's still there. And something that they may be interested in doing one day. But for us, for the story, the people, they were terribly displaced. They had to move away. And I'm fortunate in the sense I was named after my great uncle Charles Ballay, and he had a pretty big farm property over there. He did a lot, and that's how I got my name. And there's a story a little bit about him in the book. And and lo and behold, I was speaking to forgot the gentleman here earlier that we were talking. I was at here we are. I was speaking at a church function down there one day, and it was a black. I would say Baptist, I suppose, church. I was campaigning out, making my rounds everywhere, and lo and behold, it was a dedication of something. And I opened the book up like this, and they talk about their history, and the original church they had was on the East Bank, and it was moved across the river due to the taking of the property, and they rolled it, they put it on logs, and they rolled it across the river, and set it up in, I think at that time, in Narren. And I didn't even know it like this. And here it is, I'm reading this, how they originally started their church on property of a Charles Ballay way back in the early 1900s is how it was. And so a lot of people were made to, basically kind of forced to leave. We read at the archive, we went through our research, a lot of things. In fact, some of the people, I remember one lady wrote something about how, yes, I want it back. Y'all took it from me, y'all forced me off the property last time. And, some great things we'd find out in all these writings that people did. And it really was, some of the people I knew at the levy board would argue, well, we paid them for the property, and a lot of people signed. Well, the word that most of them had back then, the stories we'd hear, that if you don't sign, they're going to take it, you might get nothing. You still hear that today when people sign away property for highways or whatever happens. That still happens today, especially to people that maybe are not educated, like this, don't have the financial wherewithal. Sometimes they just know that they have to do what's best and move on like this. And that certainly happened to a good bit of that population. So that's how it was taken and done. And what's interesting is that when it was taken, and as Susan mentioned, the oil stuff, there was a book put out, was it 1911 or 1902, I forgot, yes. But it was about geologists, about salt domes, how they were significant, and wherever salt domes were, you were very likely to find oil or gas and even sulfur. And that's when some of the smarter people, educated or whatever, started realizing that wherever salt dome properties were, in Louisiana, along the coast, everywhere like this, it's a good idea maybe to buy those properties or at least get a lease on those properties, because there's going to be oil and gas. And that's the history of a lot of things, honestly, with the Perez's and the Longs, Pelches, a whole bunch of folks over there through the years. They knew if you got the right property, and it was just, what you could do. And here, the same thing is right there was a potash salt dome, and it was publicized in about 1911, I believe. And so some people start realizing if you got that property, you had a good chance of getting oil and gas. And when Spindletop, came through in Texas, they started realizing what could happen if you drilled a well in those places, and you're going to make money. And it took off. And in 1928, actually, after the Orleans Levy Board got it, that's when they signed a lease with Standard Oil. And it didn't take but a couple years later, the money started coming in. And that's what we think is a big part. Of course, it's a big part of our story. We think that's why that was the motive, the reason for the taking of the property for something 50 miles below New Orleans, where you could go, I think it's 15 or 20 miles above New Orleans, where the Bonnie Carey Spillway is. It makes a lot more sense. And they eventually did it because they had to do it, because Bohemia was not going to save the city from another 1927 flood. And that's how it happened. But anyway, a little bit more, I guess, about me when I realized that needed to do a book first. And Tony Falterman, a friend of mine, fellow DA, of course, right over here in West Baton Rouge and Iberville and Point Capee, he kept telling me, you need to do a book. You got to write a book. I got into it. I didn't do it before. So who, Tony, who you use? And he introduced me to Susan. And so that's when it started. Because as a lawyer, of course, I write briefs. I'm factual, and as a prosecutor especially, you have to have facts, and beyond a reasonable doubt, and all that stuff you have to work on. And so to write something with a story that this girl meets this guy and marries and has kids and all, that's just not my forte. That's not what I do. And so that's where he said, well, get Susan. She's working on those things. And so that's how we got together. And so it's worked real well. We did have a lot of research, as I mentioned, a lot of places. And we have a tremendous bibliography, a listing here of all the different works that we've done. And a lot of newspaper articles, New York Times, a lot of things we were able to get to make up our story, to get everything factually correct. That's basically what it was about. It was a lot of fun, I would say, writing it, and now meeting with people, you know, wherever we go here, Barnes & Noble, wherever it might be. It's really interesting, really nice to do. I like it because, you know, it's something to get out and see people do something a little different. It's a lot of fun. I hope that covers it all, and I guess we just open it. Go ahead.
1940, 1938, 1940.
Oh, yeah. The other thing, what I think I was alluding to a little earlier, but I'm glad Susan pointed, is it's funny how mineral rights went with property years ago, and then people started doing mineral reservations, and everybody's familiar. Sometimes you sell property, now you reserve the mineral rights. And I think due to the taking of this property, and there was perhaps some other government taking of things, they got an act passed in the legislature where property owners could reserve their mineral rights. And I'm not sure if that was 1938 or somewhere back then. And then the question was, how long, if you reserve them, could you keep them? And we know in other states, some places, it's basically forever. But Louisiana had a 10-year rule. And, well, I think the levee board and some people saw that might be a problem with some of this, and so they had that stuff repealed. But it became law later on, and they passed it again, I think in the 50s, if I'm not mistaken. And so that was a big question as to if they needed it for the spillway, for water to go across, to save the city, to do all that, fine. But why do you have to have the minerals and everything else? Why can't the people whose land it was like this be entitled to that stuff? Especially when the money really started pouring in. It was a big thing. And so, so anyway,
They fought it.
Yeah, they fought it like this, and they had a lot of things happen, but it wasn't until it became, I guess a lot of things, maybe with civil rights movements, maybe a number of things that caused things to move. It didn't get through the legislature until, like I said, in '84, when it actually was enough that people were entitled to get their land back. But they fought after that as far as the all money for the levee board, and eventually, I'm not sure, it was $15 million or something maybe was paid back. And that was it.
But Haspel and Davis got most of that.
Yeah, Haspel and Davis, the big guys got most of it. They had the lawyers, they had the team of people to go after to do things.
Got nothing.
Yeah, a lot of them nothing. And so that's basically how it's all occurred. And so there's some still production on it now. There's some wells out there. There's some oil fields. Cox Bay is one that's known in that area. And so some folks are getting a little, but most of the oil money, of course, is gone. And they got it, and that's kind of what happened.
In 2023, they gave it to the Lakefront Management Association.
Yeah, that was an interesting point. We were doing this, and we were notified, and Wilma gave us a little clue in something that, and actually it was in the paper pretty big, how when they split districts up of levee boards some years back, 23, but maybe a little bit before that, and they started saying that we needed the levee things that's going to handle the levee, the flooding issues, and if there was another board, maybe it would handle something else that they have. And in New Orleans, they did that where they had the part of the levee district, and then they had the things that handled the extra things that the levee had, such as levee board had, like the airport, Lakefront Airport, and a lot of things at the lakefront. Well, the counting work wasn't all done right up front, and so later on they realized that they didn't know where the dollars should go from the spillway money, all wells that they still have interest in, like this, and so they gave it to the, and I might not be remembering the word, but it's some kind of the dealing with the levee board, but it's the airport side of it, like this. The lakefront management on. And the odd thing of that is that if this thing was all set up for saving, for flooding and levees and all that sort of stuff, why the money you're getting from it goes to the side of the management, like the lakefront airport, and not to the levee board. So it doesn't go to the levee board, the levee systems in Orleans Parish at all, like this. It goes to me, that was kind of obvious proof that money and that whole thing was never needed for a levee system. It was needed for whatever else might come up. And that's in existence right now, is how they're getting some more revenue. But I guess anything else maybe you have, or any questions, I guess, is where we are. Yes, sir.
I can say, based on this book and how it's being presented, I could very well see something like another movie being made behind this, like Beast of the Southern Wild or something like that. But because you're a lawyer, I just wanted you, if you can, to just tell me what you know and what you can share about the current state of the legal aspect of that.
Wait, the current aspects of this property
Yes.
area or something else out
Yeah,
there?
to that people are still making claims, you know, to.
Yeah, well, the claim process time stopped, and not everybody made claims. I mean, because it got so fragmented that some people's interest is 1/1000th, you know, like this, and so some people didn't want to do it. And actually, when the claims process first started, I think it was $175 to pay. Some people didn't have that, and they went through some court matters, and they got it where that was waived if you showed that, of course, you were indigent, you didn't have the funds and such. So, as far as the claims process, yeah, that's been finished. And now, so the levy board actually still has some of the property, the state has some property, and you know, landowners and all that
The
stuff.
litigation is still ongoing.
Yeah, they have some litigation, but the litigation that's been going on is about monies that have been produced by all after the acts in 1984. And the levy board didn't want to go back and, you know, claw back or do anything like that. And so, and Hasbro and Davis and those people fought, they got some good judgments. And the courts eventually ruled, well, they don't have to turn the money over. You have a right, the levy board has a right to pay them over time. And that's been stalled. And I know they did some settlements for some of those dollars in the recent 10 years or so, I don't know, some time ago. And so, yeah, no, the claims thing is finished. And to my knowledge, it is. And the ones that went back got a little property, they do. But a lot of them didn't go back and get their property. It just wasn't going to happen. And so anyway, I know I mean, in the area was, since it was a spillway and, you know, the homes, everything was taken away, nothing was there, and no utilities, no infrastructure, nothing like that down there. It's never come back at all. It's just a wilderness now. It's just basically raw land is what it is. Yes, sir.
At one time, the levy board was outside Orleans Parish, so it was much larger, or it contained all of Plaquemines Parish for the quote levy board?
No, Orleans Levy Board was only Orleans Parish. Everybody had their own and they had different names in different areas. Like Plaquemines Parish, you had the Grand Prairie Levy District, which is on the east side, and of course the other side of the river had different, because you had the whole Mississippi River, so you certainly had different levy districts, different, you know, geographies on both sides. And so, but Orleans Parish had no properties, to my knowledge, no properties, interest, anything in Plaquemines Parish whatsoever before that 1924 Act.
But they went to the legislature, and the legislature gave them the right to go into Plaquemines Parish.
Because they also have, not the levy board, but Orleans has the airport in Kenner, which is outside.
Right, correct.
But my second question would be, when were the levees established in Plaquemines Parish? Because wasn't it the Great Flood, that's where they blew the levees, and that's where this came about? Or?
Yeah, where they blew the levee was up at Carnarvon. It is, you know, when they did that, yes.
But when were they must have been there beforehand.
But that was river levees. Yeah, and the river, you know, and yeah, they were there, and of course, like you said, when they blew the levee at Carnarvon, and it flooded that area, and actually flooded way down in Plaquemines Parish as well on the east bank. It did a lot of that. And so, but you didn't have, and you had levees in this area where this story is. The people had built levees like this along, you know, along the river there. They weren't anything of any size like today. They were like maybe 8 feet or something. They were small, and and so they were existing, because some of the first work that the Orleans Levy Board had to do, contracted and spent numbers of millions of dollars. They tore down all those levees. They basically did. Or they cut gaps in them, whatever they needed to do, you know.
Some of them were built with oyster shells.
Yeah, they had oyster shells. They'd used a lot of different things. And so, yeah, but yeah, that was, they had levees, yeah, up and down. And even on the West Bank, as it got established, because the East Bank was established before the West. That's why you had Point LaHash as the parish seat of Plaquemines. And on the West Bank, as they did them like this, yeah, we started out way back, plantation by plantation, we'd build their own system. In the back like this, towards the marsh like this, you had floodgates and all like this, where, you know, you get a lot of rain, it could go out through your floodgate, it could close, and your tides, the salt water wouldn't come in and ruin your crops. They were pretty decent little engineering feats that they did on some of those plantations. And on the riverside, people over the years would build levees, and so you could kind of avoid most of your high rivers flooding. And they had that in place on the East Bank before the spillway thing was started. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Are the Parassas featured in a major way in this
Wait, they mentioned that we ought to repeat. What was the question you heard?
Oh, okay. Were the Perez's featured in this book?
Yeah, Judge Perez, of course, is the character as we know of Plaquemines Parish, and the name is different. But I mean, if anybody knows the Plaquemines Parish history,
You'll recognize it.
You'll recognize it. And yeah, so he's in there, you might say, and yeah, he was very. But most of the stuff predated a little bit of Judge Perez really doing a lot of things that he did. He tried, and he really did, but actually he tried, but he was a little late to the game to get some of this stuff. They got other areas where they had salt domes in Plaquemines Parish and all fields, things that were proven like this. Yeah, Delta Development was his company that took an override on the school board properties and the parish properties and all that kind of stuff, and they made money. Delta Development was Judge Perez's company. And but here he tried, and the Orleans Levee Board people beat him to the punch by getting this property and getting a lease with Standard Oil in 1928. Now he tried in the back of this property towards, you have the river and in the marsh, and it goes out to Britain Sound, out the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America now, whatever it is. And it went out to the back, and they tried. He got a lease with, I want to say Chevron or one of the companies back there to try to get his claim, get his foot in the door. And Orleans Levee people fought him on it like this, and they got a case ruling, and they got a legislative act, I think in 41, where the spillway, it goes from the Mississippi River to the sea. It's the whole way. Because at first when they were buying these people out, most people's properties went to the 40-ARPA line. That's how a lot of properties were sold along the Mississippi River. And it was the old French thing, the ARPAs, And so beyond that was kind of wasteland almost. It was marsh. We know today, very valuable, but back then it was like I can't grow crops, can't put a house there, that sort of stuff. And so that was not really thought of it initially when they got the spillway. But after a while they realized, well, we need that too. And especially when there was oil out there too to be gotten, they got an act passed, and I'm pretty sure it was in 41, where it basically codified what they had won in a lawsuit that said that their claim goes from the Mississippi River all the way to the sea, all the way to Britain Sound back there. And Judge Perez lost out on that too. He had that because he had gotten, like I said, an override through his company, Delta Development. And that was a hidden company. That took years of litigation by Plaquemines Parish to say that that was really wrong. It should be parish stuff. And the parish eventually won, but not till, I don't know if that was around 2000 or 90s or something like that, is when they got it back, Yes?
When they settled, the Perez's kept the previous money and only gave up the future money. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. The question is when it's settled, the Perez's, the money they'd gotten already, absolutely. And they only gave forward money. In fact, one of your prominent attorneys at Baton Rouge, Ernie Eldridge, I know, was very involved in that case for the people, for the Plaquemines Parish government that went after the monies, went after to break the leases that Delta Development had on the parish properties. And they won. It settled, but of course that was also, lots of money paid out over the years, a lot. And so that was another thing. But the story, we wanted to keep it really focused in a sense on the Bohemia spillway, what that was about. And Judge Perez, as we say, was mentioned in there. In fact, we even have a little bit of color in there in the sense that he's overhearing some of these conversations at Antoine's and Arnold's and all that kind of stuff where they're scheming and planning. And he's trying to make a move on some stuff. And so they know they had to move fast and get some of this stuff done. And they did. They did get the act passed in 24, and they got the lease with Standard in 28. And so they beat him to the game. He was just coming about. He was a young lawyer. And so he was just coming about like this into realizing what power he had and what he could do. Yes, Will.
I just wanted to point out, remember, the Great Flood was 27, and who was governor from 28 to 32? None other than Huey Long. So when you put all that in context, those poor folks didn't have a prayer for their oil and gas and mineral rights. I was putting it on.
No, thank you. You meant, Huey Long. And Judge Perez and Huey Long were very, very close. And everybody knows what was a round robin, created up there to save Huey and all that stuff. Judge Perez was very, very smart lawyer. Like, very shrewd, very smart. He knew it like this. And so he and Huey Long were a good pair for what they, for what they did. Yes,
I think
sir.
y'all just answered my question, and that would have been, when we talked about the Wilkinsons earlier, were families like that, did they chirp up, or were there any other people that expressed concern that, hey, look, this may not be the right thing to do?
No, not that I could get from anywhere. I mean, Hasbro Davis was probably your biggest. I've had a few others that, you know, had, I would say it probably had money and education and everything.
But Haspel and Davis, they were the biggest ones that followed.
They're biggest, and no, I don't know. I think the act, it passed, and it was it, and there was talk about it and all, but and also with hindsight now, they had a lot of different disasters. You know, the 22 flood, 27, and you know, even 1915 storm was extremely devastating. And so I think, you know, a lot of them like this, you know, maybe this is what we're supposed to do. Maybe we're supposed to give up trying to do this stuff. So, I mean, it was, I'm sure, a little bit of all of that. It's just like after, you know, Betsy and Camille and a lot of these things in our parish and a lot of areas, some of the people just, you know, especially if they had bad luck or wiped out once or twice before, sometimes it's like, you know, maybe it's enough. Sometimes it's what it is. You know, we see that. You know, I know buddies of mine in Cameron like this after a number of bad hurricanes. They just said, look, you know, we moved to Lake Charles. We just can't keep fighting it, you know. I mean, that's what happened to a lot of them, you know. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'll try to get some points of references here. I was involved with the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation for years when I lived there in New Orleans. One of the researchers had found a natural spillway at one time on the east bank. We didn't call it a spillway. We basically just called it a low spot where if the river went to a certain level, it would flow over to Lake Bohemia. Was that in Plaquemines?
No, not to get to Lake Bourne. That's up in St. Bernard.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now, you know, St. Bernard and Plaquemines, of course, next to each other.
Right.
And when you get to Braithwaite, you know, they have a freshwater diversion thing that they put in a river there at Carnarvon, at Braithwaite, in that area. But it's strictly pipes to push fresh water out, very little settlement. And it was made to get the fresh water. But as far as a low spot, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's why they chose the area where they blew up the levee. If there was some issue with it being low enough for the water to go.
Well, I don't think there was a levee there at one time.
Yeah.
This goes back. If it was in St. Bernard, I can understand. Also, Fort Jackson. Is that St. Bernard?
Where? Fort Jackson, you said?
Yeah.
No, that's way down. That's way down in Lower Plaquemines Parish. It's below Buras,
Okay.
between Buras and Venice. And Fort Jackson's on the west bank. Fort St. Philip is on the east bank, right opposite each other on Mississippi. And that's where battles, Civil War battles with Farragut and all that stuff happens.
We would put in there, there was kind of a modified boat launch area, and we go across to the east bank, and there was a farm or something over there that had a bunch of houses and this and that, and it was, I believe that, I can't remember his name, I think it was Ashby, who was Secretary of Natural Resources.
Yeah, he was with Dave Treen, yes.
Yeah. Is that even still there? Is that finally been washed away with Katrina? Or?
What you're talking about is at Fort St. Philip, Frank Ashby, if y'all know the Ashby Oil and Gas, very prominent Republican business guy in New Orleans and all. And in fact, him and Governor Dave Treen were very close and became Secretary of DNR during Treen's administration. Frank, yeah, he owned, Fort St. Philip was of course, as I mentioned, it was a fort, and it was federal U.S. property, and him and whoever else at the time, they acquired it from the government many decades ago, a long time ago.
Right.
And it was abandoned. And they had a commune of people, back in the days of hippies, like this, a commune of people that went and lived over there, set up a little bitty village. They had their school, they raised their vegetables, they did everything. And that's where they were. And I can't recall the guy who kind of ran the thing, but it was very interesting how that was. And I can kick myself. I'd go over there and they had the old fort. They had like old bowling alleys and things, and they had remnants and things that were just kind of going to waste. And I kept saying, "Man, I ought to take a little bit of this. I ought to take a little bit of that, something like that." Never did any of that. But it would be tremendous having a kitchen island in your house with Fort St. Philip and stuff, you know. And could have done it, and it washed away with Betsy, Camille, and all the hurricanes.
I remember the commune.
Yeah.
I knew some people who lived over there.
Oh, yeah.
And the problem was the soil was so bad that they couldn't grow anything.
No, not in Fort St. Phil. That soil's rich.
Yeah.
Extreme. I have a place just about 8 miles south of that,
Oh.
and it's rich soil.
Okay.
I tell you a funny joke about Rich. My dad was a farmer from way back, and when I did a development on the river, but further up in Belchase, and my dad came out there one day, he was looking at the soil. I said, "God darn, this is rich soil, man. Y'all pick, this is good property like this. I'd build my house here and all." Yeah, good. He said, "If I'd be you, I'd go get some 10-penny nails, put them in the ground." He said, "Next week you can get 3-foot crowbars."
Now, where was the Becknell's place in relation?
Becknell's is south of Belchase a little bit, about 6 miles south of that, and along the river area. Once again, it was all built up from the centuries and centuries of the river overflowing, building up the delta. And
Somebody told me that he lost his cypress crop because of salt water.
yeah,
Because the salt became too salty, and that's why he couldn't grow his cypress trees anymore. Not cypress,
Yeah.
citrus trees.
yeah, what citrus did. Yeah, citrus has a number of hurricanes. My family's had citrus for several generations, and Betsy, Camille, and Katrina, all of them, really hurt it really bad. And actually, after Katrina, I think you had to wait several years like this for enough rain to come with the soil to leach the salt out so that you could plant trees that could work. Oh yeah, absolutely. That's always been an issue with the amount of salt.
Are they planting over there now?
Not almost none. Labor's a big issue. You're competing. The citrus grown in Florida, but now really Brazil and other countries. It's just hard to compete with any of that stuff.
Because we're affected by the salt up in the Manchac area where
Yeah.
I used to spend a lot of time.
Yep.
We tried to plant some stuff over there, and they never could take it.
Yeah.
And so that's why we went back. We need to start planting grasses,
Yeah.
and try to revive some salt. I think Southeastern's very much involved in that project.
Didn't Marcellus have some property down there?
Who?
Carlos Marcellus.
I don't know. Of course, he's a figure we all know, and he was in Avondale area where where's the super the restaurant, Mosca's restaurant, and all that area there, and but I don't think any in ours.
I never saw his name on any of this property.
Yeah. I don't recall him any kind of title work over the years. No, but he was in New Orleans area, and of course West Bank and all that big time.
This has been very interesting. We have time for one more question.
Just a footnote, compared to today, back in those days, a long time we discussed, and the Orleans Parish Levy Board was a political monster. My dad was Chevron's land attorney, so he had many contacts with Land of Perez, et cetera, and lots of stories. So I've known this for years and years. So.
Well, thank you. To me, it's I guess a money thing. I mean, before all in that like this, the Plaquemines levy people and a lot of them like this didn't have a lot of money. It's hard to tell people we need money to go build your levee so you can be protected, And then when oil and gas came around, bingo, then it got to be a different story, That's what happened.
Well, they brought some books. If anybody's interested in buying a book, we've got some books over here.
Thank y'all
Thank y'all very, very much. Enjoyed it.